Hello, I'm here with fantastic author Curtis Lawson, who has written a whole bunch of different books, and he runs a podcast, and he's a fantastic horror writer, and he's also fantastic at panels if you ever get a chance to see him in person, because he has great insight on all sorts of different topics. So welcome, Curtis.
Thank you so much. This is great.
So why don't you tell us about, we'll start with this one because I have it in my hands. And you know I adore this cover. And I suppose you have two of these out, right? Two in this series?
Yes. Okay. So it's a bad world. Is the first book is really, it was inspired by the old film It's a Mad World kind of, and I had the idea that it would be cool to write a story which is kind of an ensemble cast and a chase type of story, but instead of it having these kind of just kind of wild, silly characters, if they were all really horrible, terrible criminals and killers. So that was kind of the idea behind it, and it basically follows this group of horrible people who are trying to all get this set of magic knives that were owned by Vlad the Impaler at one point, and they're said to have magical powers. So you have a Rhodesian mercenary and this old dying occultist. You have these two serial killers who are in love, a professional sadist for hire, lunatic nun who works for kind of an offshoot of the Templars. And they're all in this mad race of murder and mayhem to get these knives. And then the second book, I had originally just planned it to be one book, but the original publisher I was working with, it didn't end up coming out from them, but they turned it into a trilogy because people like series or whatnot.
Yeah.
And I was a little reluctant at first, but I came up with some ideas that I liked. So I did a second book, which takes place 5 years later with some of the survivors, and it focuses on two of the minor characters from the first book who were just like little kids in the first book, and a few of the bigger characters. And that one it's mostly a heist story where they have to pull off a heist from the Vatican, but it's actually a little bit less ridiculous than the first. It gets a little bit more into character, and there's kind of a storyline, like a teen love storyline that tugs at the heartstrings and such. So there's it's a little bit more, I guess, slower paced than the first one. That being said, it's still a very fast-paced action book and still pretty ridiculous. And I will be doing a third book. People have been asking for a third book for a long time, and I've had other projects going on that have been kind of taking priority, but I'm hoping to get back to the third book very soon.
Great. How did you find inspiration for the characters?
So the characters kind of came first. I came up with this idea that I wanted to just write a bunch of scenes with these interesting characters. So I came up with just, I guess, characters that I thought would be fun. So a lunatic nun, I love that imagery of like this like badass nun in like these combat boots and like a leather habit and like, assault weapons. And then I've always had this kind of weird fascination with the idea of kind of serial killers on the love and in love and on the run, kind of like natural born killers and stuff like that. And I had actually started writing something about characters like that in a comic that I never finished. So I kind of lifted those characters from that comic. The sadist, the professional sadist, who basically his job is, you hire him and he'll destroy someone's life, and not like he'll kill them, like
Right.
slowly over the course of years, you know, he'll chip away at everything they love until they have nothing left. And that was actually inspired by the Will Smith movie Hitch. I came up with the idea. I was like, oh, what if somebody was like the opposite of this? Instead of trying to get people and love and like, you know, matchmaking, what if, you know, somebody was just really good at destroying people's lives, and that was their job. So that's kind of where I came up with the idea of him. And then the inept occultist Eamon Brewster, you know, he's just kind of drawn from my I guess occult stuff that I've read, you know, reading stories about like Aleister Crowley or these other folks who kind of pursued occultism for their whole lives and end up in not so great circumstances in their old age. And, you know, this guy's been pursuing this power his whole life and has basically ended up with nothing, and he's dying. And so those were the main inspirations. Oh, and then the Rhodesian. The Rhodesian is, you know, probably most of people, that's their favorite character. And the Rhodesian was, the reason I made this character was because I wanted to explore in all the characters kind of a hierarchy of evils, I guess.
Okay.
And I find it interesting where or how people determine what is more evil or more bad to them, because everybody has kind of a different hierarchy. To some people, you know, murder might be the absolute worst thing, and to other people, rape is worse than murder. Or and I grew up in the metal scene, and there was like, I listened to a lot of black metal when I was a kid, and there were these guys who did these terrible things. You know, there were arsonists and murderers, and there was this one guy, Varg Vikernes, who's in this band Burzum, and he went to jail for murder. He burnt down like 7 churches. And the thing that people always harp on about Varg is that, you know, he's very racist. And it always interested me that people seemed more bothered about the fact that he was racist than he was a murderer.
Right.
So I one of the things I wanted to explore in this was how people determine what's worse. So the Rhodesian, he's a killer for hire. He's a soldier of fortune, and he is a racist person. He calls himself the Rhodesian because he identifies with Rhodesia before it became Zimbabwe, which is, you know, he's an older guy, and that's where he lived, where he grew up in as a kid. And his family's farm was taken when Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. So he has this whole child soldier background and all this stuff. But he's also he has a code, you know, he won't kill children. He has his own code of honor. So he's definitely still a bad guy, but I wanted to examine kind of those shades of gray and the nuance in these different characters and different ideas of what, you know, that hierarchy of wrong. So that was really the main inspiration for the characters in it, was exploring those ideas and what I thought would just be fun, you know. A lot of it was like, man, I want to have like a mercenary fight a crazy nun in a like burned down church. I think that would be a cool scene. And I actually wrote the book kind of like, I just came up with a bunch of scenes that I thought would be cool, and I wrote them on note cards, and then I kind of put them together. I wrote a narrative around those ideas.
Right.
And I never expected anyone to like it. This is just something I did for fun, but people did enjoy it. So.
How did you choose the locations?
Well, most of the first book takes place in Boston, and that's just because, you know, I've lived here most of my life, so it takes place in Boston and surrounding areas. And then the second book, it takes place around Mass. Actually, it takes place in Salem, a lot of it, which is where I live now, and it takes place partially, you know, there's one scene that takes place on the Jersey Shore, which is just happens to be a place I used to go surfing. So I thought that it was a place I knew. And then the Vatican, it was once again one of those things where I was like, what would be a really cool scene? Well, what if somebody robbed the Vatican? That would be really fun to watch. And that was interesting. That was the kind of the most labor-intensive part of the book, was studying maps of Vatican City and watching documentaries and reading about the Vatican and finding out, the different aspects of the security there. We all know about like the Swiss Guard or whatever, but there's another police force there, which I can't pronounce the name of, and I'm not going to try. So I had to research, what each kind of police force within Vatican City was responsible for, what kind of weapons they used, and the layout of Vatican City, the layout of the Vatican, to figure out where I was going to put this artifact they were going after. And one of the characters, he's this kind of punk rock occultist parkour teenage kid. So he's like parkouring across like the tops of the buildings at the Vatican. So I had to research the layout from like above. So I spent a lot of time on Google Maps and stuff. And yeah, so that's how I chose the locations for that book. But most of the stuff, I wouldn't say a good chunk of it, maybe half or more, takes place in or around Boston, though, just because it's easy.
Well, but I think it's good to write about what you know.
Yeah, for sure. My book Blackheart Boys Choir, that was very musical inspired, and that's because I used to play music a lot. I played in bands for a long time when I was younger, and then in The Devoured, which was my first novel, it's an Old West kind of book, and I didn't know that much about that time period, but I put a lot of stuff about mythology in there. I've always been very interested in mythology. So I drew a lot from Norse and Native American mythology in that. So I generally try to include things that I'm interested in and passionate about and know about, even if it's not the main part of the book. And it just makes it more interesting for me, not just easier. It makes it more interesting to do.
Right. So tell us about Boys Choir.
So Blackheart Boys Choir is it's probably my favorite book that I've written. It's a lot more serious than the Bad World books. And it's about a young man named Lucien Beaumont. He's going into his senior year of high school. He's a little bit advanced. He's skipped a grade. He's only 16. And he was going to a private school, and he's come from money. His father was a very successful composer, but several years before the book started, his father killed himself. And his mother has slowly kind of squandered their money. And now they have to leave their big house and move into a small condo. He has to leave his private school and go to this public school for his senior year. And he just isn't adjusting to things well. And he is obsessed with classical music. He's obsessed with his father, and he holds himself, I guess, to what he sees as a higher standard than the rest of people. So he only wears suits all the time. He only listens to classical music, and he kind of looks down on just about everyone. And he is very intelligent. He's a gifted musician. He could have a very bright future, but he won't get out of his own way. So throughout the book, he's trying to deal with the issues of his father's suicide and his resentment toward his mother and his issues with other people. And, he's not accepted at school, and he has increasingly violent fantasies as the story goes on. And eventually he finds a piece of music that his father wrote with another composer, and it's all been blacked out. All the notes are blotted out with ink, and he becomes obsessed with restoring this piece of music, which is called the Madrigal of the World's End. And eventually he he starts, whether it's real or not is kind of up to the reader, but he starts seeing this demon named Amdusius who takes the form of a black unicorn. And Amdusius tells him that in exchange for committing increasingly violent acts, he'll reveal more and more of the song to him.
Mhm.
And Lucian kind of draws like-minded misfits towards him, other boys who are, you know, don't fit in and are troubled, and they form this choir, and things get pretty violent and crazy moving forward as he tries to complete this song.
Mhm.
It's, if I were to compare it to anything or say what I drew inspiration from in form and tone, it would be like A Clockwork Orange,
Mhm.
American Psycho, a little bit of Fight Club.
Mhm.
So there's definitely the idea of a irredeemable protagonist and also an unreliable narrator. And I know some people don't like either one of those things. I also told it in first person present tense.
Mhm.
And I know a lot of people don't like present tense. So I was like, let me do all these things that people hate and see what happens. But it's been very well received. It made the preliminary ballot for the Bram Stoker Awards last year.
Oh, wow.
St. Joshi, who's a very he's a considered by many to be the harshest critic in horror. He loved it and wrote the foreword for the book.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's done very well for me. People seem to connect with it, but it's a real hit or miss book. A lot of people really like it and they really connect to it, and other people who just they hate it. If you get it, you know, you'll really connect with it. Otherwise, you're gonna be like, I hate this character, I hate this book, I hate every. So I think if you grew up kind of troubled, if you felt like you didn't belong anywhere, then you'll probably be able to relate to the book at least on some level. And if you were more well adjusted, maybe you're not going to understand the book so well.
Well, I think it's hard on teen boys right now. Teen boys.
It is.
With the different expectations.
It is. It is, and I think that one of the things I wanted to address in this, and I don't like going too much into my like socio-political thoughts that went into the book, because my philosophy on art is really that it doesn't matter what I intended the book to be about or to I guess say. It's like once it's out in the world, it belongs to the reader, and whatever they get from it, they get from it. But when I was writing it, I was very conscious of the kind of things that teen boys and teens in general are facing in society today, and I feel like they have less and less guidance. And we live in such a subjective society now where you know, there's at one point in time, and I say this, you know, I'm not a religious person, I never was, but at one point in time you had very clear guidance of, you know, what was right and wrong, what was good and evil. You had a pretty homogenous society as far as, I guess, belief structures went. So it was very clear, this is how you're supposed to live, this is right and wrong. And for good, better or worse, you know, that has changed for better and worse, I guess. And it becomes a little bit harder to find your way in the world, at least for some people. And I think that there's a subset, especially of young men, who really need structure and really need someone to give them some guidance. And without that, they're prone to get lost and get violent. And there's a French term called anime. I think I'm saying that right. And it basically means it's sort of like a nihilism bred from not being raised. Like you're just have this laissez-faire kind of adolescence where no one tells you what's right or wrong or what to do, and you fall into this kind of moral void, this nihilistic kind of malaise. And that was a big part of my inspiration for the book, because I feel like I was like that when I was growing up. I wasn't raised in a lot of ways. I just kind of figured it out on my own. And I have a lot of friends who feel the same way. It was just like, figure it out, kid. So, and it's easy to fall into negative
Oh, sure.
negative ideas and worldviews. Yeah. So, and one of the things that I also did in the book, there's a scene where all the boys are talking about their fathers, and I tried to address the main kind of pitfalls that men face in society, is represented by each of their fathers. Lucien's father committed suicide. Asher's father was in prison. Maxwell's father left him and his mother, and JC's father was just this kind of empty, soul dead worker bee who just gave up on life. He just went to work and came home and stared at the TV, and that was, let everybody walk all over him because he was just dead inside from. So, and that was a conscious effort, was really addressing those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as I said, my first novel was The Devoured, which is a kind of a Weird West thing. It takes place right after the Civil War, and it's about a Confederate soldier who, he's coming home, and he finds that his wife is dead and his son's been taken by this demonic force. So he's kind of lost everything, and that was the purpose of the book. I wanted to write something about someone who had lost everything, which is why I made him a Confederate soldier. He lost his war, he lost his nation, now he comes home, he's lost his family. So he's this. Well, I like to write about anti-heroes and bad guys. So he's definitely not a good guy, but he's got kind of a Conan-esque thing going on, and his whole thing, like his one driving singular goal, is to save his son. That's all he has left. That's all he cares about. And he's seeking this demonic force named Thirst, who took his son. And the book is structured, it jumps between a chapter about him, and then it jumps to this, to a chapter about this boy named Emmett. And his father has left for the war and left him and his mother behind, and he's trying to she's sick, and he's trying to keep the house together. Also, his mother's a Native American and he's mixed race, so he's facing a lot of racism and things like that. And he gets involved in kind of like witchcraft, for lack of a better word, and gets involved with these otherworldly forces. And so it jumps between the chapters of these two characters who are father and son. And I was really inspired by that because in real life, I have a family friend who he had two children, and they were both heroin addicts. And he was a lawyer, and he had a real estate or insurance company, and he owned two houses and all this stuff. But basically, he ended up broke. He ended up giving up, blowing through every dollar he had, blowing through every favor I tried. And I wanted the idea of what a father is willing to do. And I did Bad World, and I've done a couple short story. I did a short story collection called Black Pantheons, which is, I guess, mostly cosmic horror stories, supernatural horror stories. And I have a book coming out this fall called Devil's Night, which is a themed collection of short stories, and they all take place on Devil's Night in 1987.
Wow.
Over the course of the same night. Yeah. So they're loosely connected. There'll be references to characters from one story and another, but they're all independent stories. And It's coming out from Weird House Press. It's going to be a limited edition hardcover, signed and numbered at first. It has a cover by Luke Spooner of Carrion House, and he also did 9 interior full-color illustrations for the hardcover.
Oh, very nice.
It's going to be a very gorgeous book. It'll have a dust jacket, but also it's going to be bound in like a faux leather with red foil stamping.
Mhm.
A nice red ribbon. It's going to be a pretty classy looking book. But yeah, that's all. So it kind of touches on 80s nostalgia in a sense, but I tried to do it without being too heavy-handed or corny. And I guess the main themes of that go into urban decay and economic disparity, and just the trials of trying to get by in a really tough situation. Detroit has had a tough way to go for a long time, but around like the late 80s with Devil's Night and everything, and they had heroin and crack epidemics, and there was a gang called the Young Boys, I think it was called, which they basically wrote the book on how the modern American drug cartels will work, and these were teenagers from Detroit.
Right.
So it was interesting to explore a lot of this that was going on there. I had been intrigued by the idea of Devil's Night since I saw The Crow when I was a kid, and I didn't even realize it was real until years after that. So when I found out that it was a real thing, it just blew me away to think about having to deal with that every year. So it was a cool book to write. There was, aesthetically, I got to play with themes of fire and a lot of urban aesthetic, and I kind of dig that grungy urban aesthetic. Like it goes back to old punk rock kind of stuff for me, and but I was also able to jump around in the types of horror stories that I wanted to tell and keep it connected, because it was still a common theme, but I was able to do supernatural horror stories. I was able to do kind of more thriller stuff where there's nothing supernatural, there's just bad people. I was able to do a little bit more kind of weird, trippy, ambiguous stuff. And it was nice to have the freedom to go in these different directions, but still have it all drawn together in a cohesive theme. And I'm pretty proud of it. I think that people will like it, and I've gotten some good feedback from beta readers and such. And once again, St. Joshi, who I mentioned earlier, he gave me a really good blurb for it, and I hope people enjoy it at least a portion of as much as I enjoyed writing it.
Well, it sounds great. So tell us about your podcast.
Yeah, so I have a podcast called Weird Transmissions, and it's basically just a long form interview thing. I usually goes about an hour and a half. And I interview pretty much anybody I think is interesting. I'm trying to keep it to dark art. I chose something that was kind of broad. So I've been talking to musicians, artists, and authors, mostly authors. But I just, even before, COVID hit and social distancing and everything, I found myself wanting to have more meaningful conversations. And I'm a stay-at-home dad mostly, and I spend a lot of my time with a 12-year-old, and which is great. I love my son and I love spending time with him. But when I'm not there, if I'm at work or something like that, my job isn't really conducive to the types of conversations I want to have about art and these other things. So instead of waiting once or twice a year for a convention or something like that, I decided to have a podcast so I could have these conversations more often.
Mhm.
And it gave me an excuse to talk to people who I really admire and have these wonderful conversations with them. And I've had Ramsey Campbell on there, who's
Yeah.
like a living legend in
Yeah.
horror. He's such a wonderful guy. He was very cool to talk to. I've had some friends of mine from the New England horror writing scene, where it's
Mhm.
just kind of an excuse to get online and talk to each other.
Yeah.
I've had musicians who I really like. St. Joshi was on there, who has been so supportive of me in my career, and he's just a wealth of knowledge on horror and weird fiction. He's the world's leading expert on H.P. Lovecraft. He's my favorite writer.
Oh.
So we had a great conversation, and yeah, it's just been wonderful for myself on a social and mental level to have these
Mhm.
conversations with people and to learn from them. And if I could turn it into something, if I could monetize it and like make something out of it, that would be great. But right now, I'm just kind of using it to con people that I admire into talking to me. And yeah, it's been great though. I feel very fortunate about the people that I've gotten to come on the show, and I've learned a lot. Just talking to them on the air, but also off the air,
Mhm.
about kind of the business side of things, about agents, about this press or that press. Yeah, it's been fantastic, and hopefully I can keep it going, and I can keep getting interesting guests, and
Mhm.
I hope that I get better at it and do less ums and all the knows too. That's another one that I do. Um, so hopefully I get better at my presentation as it moves forward as well.
Mhm. Who inspires you?
Oh, so as far as writing goes,
Mhm.
my biggest inspirations for writers are Lovecraft's the name that comes to mind
Mhm.
immediately, but also um, Clyve Barker is a huge one for me. For newer guys, Matthew Bartlett is someone who his WXXT stuff is really inspiring to me because it's wildly original, and I love the world building. And same with Jeffrey Thomas. He did this Punktown series, which he did this incredible world building, created this iconic thing, and it kind of defies genre, just from sci-fi and horror and fantasy. So those are some of the guys who inspire me from modern stuff. Also, John Langan, I think, is probably, in my opinion, the best horror writer in the world right now.
Oh.
And um, when I read John Langan stuff, it's one of those things where I almost am anti-inspired. I'm like, why do I even bother? But it makes me want to become a better writer.
Right.
Um, and I also draw a lot of inspiration from not just prose writers, but I did comics for about 10 years before I started writing prose. So Frank Miller has been a huge
Mhm.
inspiration on my work. And people say I have a very visual writing style, and I chalk that up to writing comics and growing up on comics. But like Frank Miller, Sam Keith, Neil Gaiman, um, Brian Michael Bendis, his crime stuff, his old crime comics were had a big influence on me. Sam Keith for his kind of the fantastical elements of his work, not as dark as Clyve Barker, but wildly fantastical in ways that remind me of it. And then filmmakers too, John Carpenter, Wes Craven. Um, I grew up on that 80s stuff, and um, Nightmare on Elm Street was a huge thing for me in cultivating my love for horror. But Clyve Barker, his storytelling is so diverse, and it's always so good. So John Carpenter has been a huge influence on me. And then there's also I'm inspired by music a lot. So whether it's just the feeling that I get from listening to my favorite composers like Tchaikovsky or Beethoven or Barber, or if it's the kind of imagery and feeling I get from like black metal or punk rock. I draw a lot of inspiration from that. And yeah, so it comes from everywhere. And as far as ideas and such, I also read a lot of nonfiction. I like reading about history a lot, so I draw a lot of inspiration from different historical texts or biographies, things like that. In Blackheart Boys Choir, one of the things I actually did, I've always had a kind of pedestrian interest in classical music, I guess, but I needed to dive deeper into that, and I read up on these composers so I could have all this information, not just about their music, but about their lives and their quirks, and that a lot of that made it into the book. This little trivia about Wagner and about Paganini and all these things. So and even going back, like there's this thing years ago I read a book on Wagner called The Tristan Chord, and there's this part about how he wanted to create this theater on the Rhine to perform his Ring Cycle. And on the fourth night after the last opera, he was going to burn it down. The way that the operas end. And just that little thing has stuck with me for years. And, I wanted a way to work that into something.
Right.
So, I find inspiration from all these things. Advice for, so my main advice, I think the best advice I can give is write what you want to write. And I don't mean to be completely, don't be completely without filter, I guess, but write what I guess you feel is important, what you are driven to write. And that doesn't mean if you feel like working on this project today, work on this project. If you feel like working on that project tomorrow, work on that project. I personally believe in trying to work on one thing at a time, and you should have discipline in your writing, but don't write something because you think it's going to sell or you think it might be a movie or that's what's hot right now. Write something that you're truly passionate about and that you truly love, because the chances of making real money at this are so slim anyways. Almost nobody does. So if you're doing it for that, you're probably gonna lose. But if you're writing something that you love, no matter what happens at the end of the day, you have something that no one can ever take away from you. It's yours forever, and you can look back at that for your entire life and take real pride in that. And if it does blow up, if it does, get you rich and famous and all these wonderful things, there'll be such a greater pride with it than thinking, oh, I just did this for the money. To know that this thing that you're passionate about has real merit to other people. So that's my number one bit of advice. But aside from that, I would just advise about discipline, because I find, I've seen this in myself when I was younger. I see it in a lot of creative people that think they're serious about something and they're not. The other thing is do the work, because you can talk about how you're going to be a famous writer, you're going to be a famous musician, art is your life. But if you're spending Friday and Saturday night out with your friends and you put an hour into whatever your art is a week, or a couple hours a week, that's not going to cut it, because there are people who it really is their life. And they're putting everything they have into it. And if you're not, and it's fine if you're not willing to do that, as long as you realize that and know what to expect. If it's a hobby and you just want to do an hour a week, 2 hours a week, that's fine, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But you have to be realistic with yourself. And if you really, really want it, you need to really, really work for it. I'm sorry, I don't know if you hear my dog going crazy in the other room.
That's atmosphere.
Right now, I'm working a lot. My wife has been working at home because of everything that's going on, which means that she's home with our son so I can work more elsewhere. So all summer I've been working pretty much full time again, but it's been hard for me because for the past 2 or 3 years I've been a stay-at-home dad. And I've only been working like at 1 or 2 days a week, and I write. Generally speaking, I write at least 3 hours a day. And not being able to do that is killing me. It's very difficult, and I find myself thinking about writing in all these times when I can't. And that's kind of always been the case. Whenever I'm working like a full-time job, whenever I'm at work, all I'm thinking about is writing. And which is funny because sometimes if I'm sitting at home, I'll be like, well, I should watch TV. Maybe I'll watch TV instead. Like, and I'll have to fight these urges. But when I can't do it, I want to do it really bad. So it's been difficult, trying to adjust to this thing, and it's temporary. I know things will normalize, and I'll get back to my routine of writing X number of hours. But yeah, it's beyond a craving though. It's a drive. It's a calling. Like I have to do it, and I feel like even if I wasn't seeking to get myself published, if I wasn't trying to share my work with other people, I would still be producing, because I just always kind of have. When I was a little kid, I would make up stories, and then when I was a teenager, I would write poetry and songs, and I wrote lyrics and music up until my mid-20s, and then I wrote comics for years, and then I moved to prose, and it's just something I can't not do. I don't know how to not do that. So I write with music. It depends. It actually plays a fairly big part in my process, I think. It sets the tone. So with the Devoured, I was at that point, my first 2 books I wrote when I was still working at a different job, and I was working about 60 hours a week. I had an hour commute each way on the train, and most of my first 2 books were written on train rides and lunch breaks. And it's really hard to write a Western that takes place right after the Civil War when you're on the Red Line. So to get into the right frame of mind. So I listened to a lot of old school country when I was writing that, a lot of psychobilly, and just anything I could to kind of put myself in this mental landscape that was fitting to the book. And the same thing with Boys Choir. I listened to, it took me the better part of a year to write that book, and I listened to almost nothing but classical music during that time. And part of it is just I love music, so I'd like to have music playing anyways. But it can really set an atmosphere for me. And I think too, I mentioned that I'm kind of a visual storyteller in a lot of ways. So when I'm kind of laying out the architecture of a scene in my head, I see it more like a film. And so there's always a soundtrack to that. And that helps me it helps me with pacing. It helps me with the structure. So yeah, and then occasionally, I'll lapse into times where I'm writing in silence, but that's the exception. It's usually when I'm really in the zone and the music is stopped and I don't notice. Any other thoughts? That's a very broad question. Well, let's see. I guess if I have just like kind of an open platform, I would just say that in terms of fiction, yeah, I guess this could go back to like advice for writers or just my general thoughts on art and fiction. I think it's really important to be able to explore any idea, and I'm a little bit concerned about the atmosphere in the arts, which I think is a reflection of the atmosphere in the world right now because of all like the political all the kind of political turmoil that we're going through.
Mhm.
But there's almost, in a lot of circles, there are new taboos in art, and they're being pushed by people within the arts as
Mhm.
opposed to people from outside the arts. And it's almost like you can't write about certain things, or you can't ask certain questions. And there's this thought that you shouldn't write outside of your experience now, and, not by everyone, but
Mhm.
in certain circles. And I think that that's a dangerous thought for art.
Mhm.
And I think that if you're going to write outside of your experience, if you're going to write about someone from a different ethnic background, from someone of a different gender, a different life experience, you absolutely need to do so with respect, and you have to work to do your best research,
Mhm.
um, and approach it with a real sense of empathy. But if you're not allowed to do that, if you're only allowed to write about what you've experienced firsthand, um, and you're not allowed to explore ideas that aren't your own, whether they're positive or negative, I think that that's very limiting to art. And I see a lot of artists kind of pushing that right now, and that kind of worries me about the future of all art forms.
Mhm.
Um, like I said, I think these things need to be approached with tact, but to take something off the table and say you're not allowed to do this, I think is just detrimental for creators, for consumers of art, for everyone. And yeah, and I'm sure that things will settle down once our political situation settles down a little bit. But um, tempers are high everywhere, and everybody's worried and concerned. So I definitely get it. But I think that we have to realize that our job as artists is to empathize with other people and put ourselves in their shoes and try to understand them, and also to explore any ideas that really interest us and grab a hold of us. That's why art exists to me.
Right.
So
Right.
that's my other thoughts.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much for joining me. It was great to talk with you, and everyone should look for all of Curtis's different works.
Yeah, this was excellent.
All right. Have a great night.
Thank you so much, Lisa.